Exchange Committee, I'd like to welcome all of you to this evening's dialogue. I'm Arthur Urbano, Associate Professor of Theology and Chair of the Jewish Catholic Theological Exchange Committee, which plans and organizes these twice-yearly events. The mission of our series, called Theological Exchange Between Catholics and Jews, is to foster interreligious learning, mutual understanding, and friendship by creating forums for honest and authentic dialogue and engagement. Through lectures, dialogues, colloquia, and student engagement, we aim to provide opportunities for Catholics and Jews to learn about and from one another. It's good to see so many students here this evening, and I'd also like to welcome, in a special way, those of you joining us from beyond the gates. Your loyal presence here is a testament to the value and the good of our regular gatherings. Watch out, this is on wheels, apparently. Okay. Okay. I'd also like to thank Father James Cuddy and the Center for Catholic and Dominican Studies, the President's Office, the School of Arts and Sciences, and the Diocese of Providence for the support in making this evening possible. Gratitude is also owed to our faithful and generous donors, Jews and Christians, alumni, and community partners. We really could not do this without you, so thank you. Your generosity is a blessing. If you are new to our events and would like to learn more, there are brochures at the table at the entrance here, so please feel free to take one of those. There's a link to our website and also information about ways that you can help our program. We have a very special discussion tonight. Our guests will address the topic, the next steps in Catholic-Jewish relations. Two perspectives. As many of you know, 2015 marked the 50th anniversary of the Vatican II document Nostra Aetate. That document was pivotal in redirecting the relationship between Jews and Christians from one of mistrust and hostility to one of respect and dialogue. It's the reason why we're able to have events such as this one. But Nostra Aetate was not the final concluding chapter, the happy ending to an otherwise tragic story, as it were. Instead, it was the beginning of a new chapter, the beginning of a new beginning, as Cardinal Walter Kasper has called it. It's a work that's still in progress, and our guest tonight will talk about where this chapter is heading. It's my distinct honor to welcome to Providence College Rabbi Abraham Skorka and Dr. Philip Cunningham. Rabbi Skorka was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He has a PhD in chemistry and attended the Latin American Rabbinical Seminary. He served as the rabbi of the B'nai Tikva Synagogue for 42 years and the rector of the Rabbinical Seminary in Buenos Aires for 20 years. He has been committed to interreligious dialogue and worked closely in Buenos Aires with then Archbishop Jorge Bergoglio, who we now know as Pope Francis. Among Rabbi Skorka's many writings, On Heaven and Earth, which he co-authored with Pope Francis, stands out. Most recently, he also wrote one of the prefaces for an Italian volume titled La Bibbia dell'Amicizia, the Bible of Friendship, a selection of commentaries on the Torah by both Jews and Christians. The other preface was written by Pope Francis. Rabbi Skorka is currently serving as university professor at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, where he is working closely with the Institute for Jewish-Catholic Relations there. Professor Philip Cunningham is professor of theology and director of the Institute for Jewish-Catholic Relations at St. Joseph's University. He earned his PhD at Boston College and has taught at both BC and Notre Dame. He has served as president of the International Council of Christians and Jews and on the Advisory Committee on Catholic-Jewish Relations for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. He is currently Secretary-Treasurer of the Council of Centers on Jewish-Christian Relations and the webmaster of a great website which has all sorts of important resources on Jewish-Christian relations. His most recent book is titled Seeking Shalom, The Journey to Right Relationship Between Catholics and Jews. So the way that our event will work tonight, each of our guests will present and speak, and then there will be time for questions from the audience and discussion among the speakers. So when we say dialogue and exchange, we're including all of you as well. So we look forward to your questions and to the talks by our speakers. And who's going first? And I'd like to welcome up to the podium first Rabbi Abraham Skorka.
Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you so much for your kind introduction, Professor Urbano. Let us talk about the next steps in Catholic-Jewish relations. It's not an easy issue, an easy theme, because what results very, very clear from Nostra Aetate and from all the documents after Nostra Aetate is that the clashes, the blamings, and let's say the bad things that occurred between Jews and Christians in the past must be overcome. After the Shoah, we must work together, as Abraham Yoshua Heschel said in his famous article, essay, "No religion is an island." We must come together and we must work together against all those powers in our modern society. He presented that in 66, this article, if I well remember. All the powers of modern world that are diminishing the dimensions of the importance of the Bible, of the values of the Bible, that are elements so essential for our identity, for our way of thinking and of living, and all those values about justice, about pureness, about moral, that already then, in the late 60s, it began to be shocked by a humanity in evolution. I recall that at the end of September 2013, while I was staying at the Vatican guest house, the Domus Sancta Marta, I asked Pope Francis what the next step in the Jewish-Catholic dialogue should be. He replied that it must now become more theological in nature. I then asked him what would be good to read about this, and he recommended two books. One in Spanish, Dos Caminos, una Redención hacia el diálogo teológico judeo-cristiano, by Yoel Ben Arieh. That the translation more or less is two ways, one redemption, towards a theological dialogue, Jewish-Christian dialogue. And the other book is La Promesse, The Promise, from Aharon Jean-Marie Cardinal Lustiger. The first book, which we both read when its author presented it to us in Buenos Aires, proposed that both the Jewish and the Christian religions are true and that both are moving toward the same redemption at the end of days. Even though for the time being they travel along different paths. Lustiger's book is a collection of lectures he gave in Tel Aviv, Paris, Brussels, and Washington about the significance of the dialogical re-encounter between Jews and Christians in history. Lustiger as a Jew who was baptized as a teenager during the Second World War, whose mother was killed in the Shoah, and who became the Archbishop of Paris and the Cardinal, was a very unique figure who raised challenging questions for both Jews and Christians. But What do we mean by a theological dialogue? Of course, it must be something absolutely different from the disputations between rabbis and priests that occurred during the Middle Ages. In order to develop the real, sincere, and creative dialogue between Jews and Catholics, any notions of refuting the beliefs of the other must be renounced. Supersessionism over Judaism cannot be part of Christian theological toolbox in future dialogues. And regarding Christianity as an idolatrous cult cannot be part of Jewish presuppositions when entering into dialogue with Christians. A fundamental attitude of openness toward the other must prevail. As Pope Francis wrote in the book we co-authored, dialogue is born from a respectful attitude toward the other person, from a conviction that the other person has something good to say. It supposes that we can make room in our hearts for their point of view, their opinion, and their proposals. To dialogue, one must know how to lower the defenses, to open the doors of one's home, and to offer warmth. End of the quote. As is well known, the influential Rabbi Yosef Ber Soloveitchik was opposed to theological interreligious dialogue during the first overtures between the Vatican and the World Jewish Congress during the papacy of John the 23rd in the early 60s. More recently, his great-nephew, Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik, published in the magazine The Forward in April 25, 2003, issue a very interesting article entitled How Soloveitchik Saw Interreligious Dialogue. In it, he explains the famous rabbi's reasons for refusing the dialogue. He wrote, the Rav's opposition to communal and organizational interfaith dialogue was partly predicated upon the prediction that in our search for common ground, a shared theological language, Jews and Christians might each sacrifice our insistence on the absolute and exclusive truth of our respective faith, blurring the deep divine between our respective dogmas. In an essay in 1964 titled Confrontation, Rabbi Yosef Ber Soloveitchik, the uncle of Meir, who wrote this, is quoting his uncle. The author says that his uncle, Rabbi Soloveitchik, argued that a community's faith is an intimate and often incommunicable affair. Furthermore, a faith, by definition, insists that its system of dogmas, doctrines, and values is best fitted for the attainment of the ultimate good. In his essay, the Rav warned that sacrificing the exclusive nature of religious truth in the name of dialogue would help neither Jews nor Christians. Any equalization of dogmatic certitudes and waiving of eschatological claims spell the end of the vibrant and great faith experiences of any religious community, he wrote. And he wrote means that the uncle wrote, and now is the end of the quote of Meir Soloveitchik. Soloveitchik's arguments are very coherent, but they do not apply to the type of dialogue that Pope Francis and I experienced together. Neither of us had any intention of sacrificing our own religious truth and identity, nor did we expect it of each other. Rather, we try to understand each other better, acknowledging basic differences, but keeping in mind the many spiritual ties we shared. Both books mentioned by Francis have a common viewpoint: the mutual acceptance by Jews and Christians of the importance of the other in the paving of path of spirituality that leads humans to God and the Creator to the creatures made in the divine image. Yoel Ben Arieh's book develops the idea that Judaism and Christianity are two complementary ways of redemption. In the speeches of Cardinal Lustige to his Jewish brothers, he calls them to be very loyal to their spiritual heritage, making it clear that Lustiger also saw the relationship between Judaism and Christianity as complementary. The dialogue Francis and I experience is not merely an interchange of information in which we each feel comfortable with our own faith and prepare ourselves to discover weaknesses in the face of the other. It is a dialogue of empathy, of respect. Humility is one of the most important elements in this. By humility, I mean the attitude of not presuming to know all of God's ways of thinking and acting. The Torah teaches to Jews and Christians that God is, I quote in Exodus 34:6, gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in love and fidelity. But the fullness of how these attributes manifest themselves in the totality of God is unknowable to human beings. The book of Job, as well as the story of the prophet Hananiah ben Azur in Jeremiah 26:27, powerfully express this message. Martin Buber, the master philosopher of dialogue and one of its major inspirers in the past century, thought that there was a fundamental divergence between Judaism and Christianity in terms of how they understand faith. Nonetheless, he saw complementarities between the two traditions, as he concluded in his book, Two Types of Faith. And I'm quoting Buber. The faith of Judaism and the faith of Christendom are by nature different in kind, each in conformity with its human basis, and they will indeed remain different until mankind is gathered in from the exiles of their religions into the kinship of God. But an Israel striving after the renewal of his faith through the rebirth of the person, and the Christianity striving for the renewal of its faith through the rebirth of all of nations, I would say all nations, still have something as yet unsaid to say to each other and help to give to one another, even if that is hardly to be conceived at the present time. End of the quote. Buber's proposal is that the Jews and Christian relationship is a matter of complementarity, not of any kind of syncretism, because the two faiths are distinct each from the other. As is well known, the new relationship that now exists between Jews and Catholics began with the Second Vatican Council Declaration Nostra Aetate in 1965. In its aftermath, Catholics had to unlearn old habits and begin to think of Jews and God as linked in a perpetual covenant. This continues to raise challenging questions of Catholic theology, as an essay published last summer by Emeritus Pope Benedict XVI makes clear. But it is also not easy for Jews to imagine Jews and Christians as having, on quotation signs, I put that, a common covenantal mission to perfect the world under the sovereignty of the Almighty. End of the quotations. In the words of a recent Orthodox statement entitled, "To do the will of our Father in heaven toward the partnership between Jews and Christians." There are centuries of hostility between us, and the living memory of genocide committed in Christian countries haunts us. The deep split between Jews and Christians began in the first centuries of the Common Era. Some polemical writings, such as Justin's Dialogue with Trypho and the Peripascha of Melito of Sardis, demonstrate the deep chasm that estrange our two communities. Theologically, Jews have debated for centuries whether Christianity engaged in paganic idolatry because of its use of images of God and Jesus as divine, and its teachings about the one God as somehow three. I have to confess that even now, after years of learning from and with Christians, that I feel discomfort seeing long lines in Catholics in my native Argentina, waiting hours in the hot sun for a brief glimpse of an icon of some saint. My point is that after nearly 2 millennia of estrangement and suspicion, it remains a task for us in the future to continue to build trust and authentic understanding between us. As I mentioned a moment ago, the issuance of Nostra Aetate was a historical turning point for relations between Jews and Catholics. Let me quote a pivotal section of it. The Church of Christ acknowledges that, according to God's saving design, the beginnings of her faith and her election are found already among the patriarchs, Moses and the prophets. She professes that all who believe in Christ, Abraham's sons according to the faith, are included in the same patriarch's call, and likewise that the salvation of the church is mysteriously foreshadowed by the chosen people's exodus from the land of bondage. The church, therefore, cannot forget that she received the revelation of the Old Testament through the people with whom God, in his inexpressible mercy, concluded the ancient covenant. Nor can she forget that she draws sustenance from the root of that well-cultivated olive tree onto which have been grafted the wild shoots, the Gentiles. Indeed, the church believes that by his cross, Christ, our peace, reconciled Jews and Gentiles, making both one in himself. End of the quotation from Nostra Aetate. From such words began what Pope Francis has called our journey of friendship, leading up to words he himself wrote in his 2014 exhortation Evangelii Gaudium. I quote the paragraph 247 of Evangelii Gaudium. We hold the Jewish people in special regard because their covenant with God has never been revoked, for the gifts and the call of God are irrevocable. The church, which shares with Jews an important part of the sacred scriptures, looks upon the people of the covenant and their faith as one of the sacred roots of her own Christian identity. As Christians, we cannot consider Judaism as a foreign religion, nor do we include the Jews among those called to turn from idols and to serve the true God. With them, we believe in the one God who acts in history, and with them we accept his revealed word. End of the quote. Great strides were also taken on the Jewish side, including a number of Jewish statements made in 2015 and 2016 to mark the golden anniversary of Nostra Aetate. So now we ask, how do we pursue a theological dialogue today? What is a common vision that could help Jews and Christians to more deeply comprehend each other and collaborate together? Since the generation of Isaiah, Hosea, Micha, and Amos, a new style of prophecy arose in Israel. Prophecy written down in text, Nevi'ei Sefer in Hebrew. That is why they are called the writing prophets, Nevi'ei Sefer. They and later biblical prophets articulated the spirit of the Jewish people, purifying their belief so that after the destruction of Jerusalem, the first destruction, by Nebuchadnezzar, Nabucodonosor, paganism was totally abandoned by the Jews, as it is affirmed, for instance, in the Tractate of Yomah from the Talmud 9b. What could be called a revitalized spiritual Judaism sprouted in the days of Ezra, according to Tosefta Sanhedrin 4:7. The Dead Sea Scrolls have revealed to us the spirituality that developed in the centuries before Jesus and during his time. The prophetic writings in their Greek translation are the major sources for the Hebrew biblical quotations in the New Testament, indicated that Jesus continues the spiritual heritage. The books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the other 12 prophetic books must be the theological reference for the Jewish-Christian dialogue, and not only for this special dialogue, but also for dialogues with Muslims and other people and faiths. Let me explain why I think a dialogue grounded in the Hebrew prophets is essential by referring to the document on human fraternity that Pope Francis signs together with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University, Ahmed Al-Tayeb, in early February of this year in Abu Dhabi. I think this text has the potential to be a cornerstone for how the religions are henceforth viewed in the world. It has been controversial for some Catholics. On February 8th, Bishop Anastasius Schneider of Astana, Kazakhstan, a majority Muslim country, released a statement titled "The Gift of Filial Adoption, the Christian Faith, the only valid and the only God-willed religion." This is the title of the statement. The subtitle clearly alluding to the assertion in the document of human fraternity, signed under by the Imam and the Pope, that the diversity of religions is, in quotation signs, willed by God. Toward the end of the gift of filial adoption, Bishop Schneider argues that the apostles and other martyrs would have spared themselves the terrible death if they had believed that the pagan relations and its worship is a way which as well corresponds to the will of God. On the same day, Cardinal Gerhard Müller, head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith between 2012 and 2017, released a document called a Manifesto of Faith, which, as he explains in the opening lines, was intended as a response to growing confusion about the faith. Müller does not explicitly address the document on human fraternity signed by Francis and El Tayeb, but his manifesto does appear to respond to it indirectly. Unlike Schneider, Müller bases his argument on Christ's establishment of the Church for the purpose of the salvation of souls, a theme stressed in the magisterial document of 2000 Dominus Jesus. Today, many Christians are no longer even aware of the basic teachings of the faith. So there is a growing danger of missing the path to eternal life. End of the quotation from Dominus Jesus. While Müller does not refer to Islam explicitly, he does write that, I quote Müller, "We are to resist the relapse into ancient heresies with clear resolve, which saw in Jesus Christ only a good person, brother and friend, prophet and moralist." At the heart of Islamic teaching on Christ is the rejection of his divinity and affirmation of his prophethood. Müller insists that the proper faith, the faith that saves, involves the confession that Christ is, first and foremost, the world that was with God, and his God, the Son of the Father. Müller, who later refers to the dreadful possibility of eternal condemnation, insists that one must not keep silent about the truth of the faith by which humans are saved. Other Catholic observers have looked for more sympathetic ways to understand the document on human fraternity. The popular Catholic blogger Father John Zulsdorf writes, "We must seek a way to understand this without it sounding like heresy." And goes on, this is his words, and he goes on to note that God has both an active will and a permissive will. For example, God permit Adam and Eve to sin, although God foresaw that sin. Perhaps the plurality of religions is something that falls under the later category. Chad Pickhold of the Catholic University of America presents another possibility in an interview with a Catholic news agency, namely that the diversity of religions is evidence of our natural desire to know God and might for the reason and to this extent be willed by God. the Second Vatican Council Declaration Nostra Aetate, he writes, speaks of a perception of a hidden power common to humanity, and adds that the Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in other religions. In March the 27th of this year, in this issue of the magazine Commonwealth, Gabriel Said Reynolds, that I'm quoting in the before paragraphs that I read, is a re-elaboration of all this information that I took from this article. He wrote a which is a very interesting and insightful article in which he discusses the different Christian reactions to the document on human fraternity. And Said Reynolds wrote, I'm quoting, that very day the people tweeted the day of the signing of the document, the Pope tweeted, the document on human fraternity, which I signed today in Abu Dhabi with my brother, the Grand Imam Al-Azhar, invites all persons who have faith in God and faith in human fraternity to unite and work together. End of the quote. This exchange reveals that a positive attitude toward dialogue does not prevail in minds of some Catholic leaders. That is why I believe that the language for theological dialogue at large, and in the Jewish-Christian dialogue specifically, must be rooted in the perspectives and words of the Hebrew prophets, in the vision of Isaiah 2:4 and Micha. God will bring about a reality of peace in which, I quoting the verses, they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. And in Micha, in 4th chapter, he adds to this prophecy, everyone will sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid, for the Lord Almighty has spoken. All the nations may walk in the name of their gods, but we will walk in the name of the Lord, our God, forever and ever. End of the quote. The task proposed by these prophets is to work for peace, not to change the identity of the others. Each one will approach God's mountain when his own beliefs, but with a great common denominator: peace based on the full respect and honor towards the other. Only to be excluded are pagans, by which I mean cults such as Nazism and fascism that disrespect the life of each human being, thereby contrasting absolutely with biblical values. The God of the Bible desires harmony among of people and no war and no violence. Such harmony cannot be achieved if the superiority of one culture and belief is asserted. In the past, such an attitude has led to war, hate, and human destruction. Rabbi Yoshua from Sachnin declared on behalf of Rabbi Levi, so appears in Bereshit Rabbah, the famous midrash of the first book of the Torah, that the quarrel between Cain and Abel, Cain and Hevel in Hebrew, was about the site where the holy temple had to be built. One said it should be built in his plot of land, and the other insisted it should be built on his plot. The end of their quarrel is very well known. It is the same end as all the disputations of the past. When one considers that his religion, culture, or race is superior to that of all others and tries to impose it on others, or kills others for the mere fact of being other. Humility must be the mindset to adopt for the future. No one can consider that he is the sole owner, the only one and absolute owner of the absolute truth. Instead, let us learn about the Holy One who is above all and transcends altogether. Thank you so much.
So good evening, everyone. My friend Rabbi Skorka, as you just heard, has used the word complementarity many times to portray the relationship that should exist between Christians and Jews. I'd like to use a form of that word to describe what the remarks that I'd like to offer. They're not so much a response to what Rabbi Skorka has just said, but rather a set of complementary comments from a Catholic perspective. First of all, there can be no doubt that the years since 1965 have been epochal for relations between the Catholic and Jewish communities. Of the 16 documents issued by the Second Vatican Council, Nostra Aetate may be the only one that is celebrated annually because of its positive impact. It is also reasonable to see it as the Council's most transformative document. As a member of the drafting team that prepared what became Nostra Aetate has written, quote, "It could be argued, I think, that the Church's recognition of the spiritual status of Jewish religion is the most dramatic example of a doctrinal turnabout in the age-old magisterium ordinarium of the Catholic tradition, the ordinary magisterium of the Church. Jewish commentators have called Nostra Aetate revolutionary, the Magna Carta for a new relationship, unprecedented, and a Copernican paradigm shift. Why such dramatic characterizations, you may ask? It is because, in the words of Cardinal Walter Casper, quote, "The old theory of substitution is gone with the Second Vatican Council. For us Christians today, the covenant with the Jewish people is a living heritage, a living reality," end quote. In the 54 years since the promulgation of Nostra Aetate, Catholic ecclesiastical statements and papal addresses have step by step been developing a sophisticated theological understanding of the relationship between Jews and Christians, an exercise in constructive theology whose breadth and depth arguably has not been matched in any other Christian tradition. I suggest a concise phrase that sums up the current Catholic understanding of our interfaith relationship, and that is to describe Jews and Christians as co-covenanting companions. To me, these words convey these key aspects of current Catholic thought. One, covenanting as a verb expresses the awareness that covenant is not an object to be possessed or that can be taken from one and possessed by another. Rather, covenanting is a dynamic relationship that is shared between parties. Two, co-covenanting indicates that while both Jews and Christians are covenanting with God, they do so in different ways. And are distinctive communities, but their experiences of walking with the same Holy One causes many resonances to exist between their ways of walking. And 3, as companions on the journey to the age to come, they can assist each other in living out their respective and common covenantal duties. That's what I think it sums up with the phrase co-covenanting companions. Now, the continuing developments in constructive Catholic theology have tremendous implications, among other things, for the topics of Christology, how Christ Jesus is understood, soteriology, how salvation is conceived, and for Christian and Jewish identity definition, how we understand ourselves in relation to the other. Partially taking my cues from Rabbi Skorka's remarks, I'd like to reflect briefly on each of these 3 topics. To begin, let me offer several quotations from Pope Francis over the past few years. His comments illustrate the ongoing Christological and soteriological growth. I hope you're all noticing those multisyllabic words, especially students. You're getting your tuition's worth by having these multiple. The growth that is currently underway. These quotations are provided on the handout that I hope you all received. And if you look at quote number 1, this is actually the next paragraph of Evangelii Gaudium that Rabbi Skorka quoted earlier. Quote, God continues to work among the people of the Old Covenant and to bring forth treasures of wisdom that flow from their encounter with his word. For this reason, the church also is enriched when she receives the values of Judaism, end quote. Now, while Francis's predecessors, John Paul II and Benedict XVI, have written in a similar vein, here Francis expresses rather explicitly the post-Nostra Aetate Catholic conviction that Israel's ongoing covenantal life with God is continuous and life-giving. When I say Israel here, I mean the community of the Jewish people. Now, this is a far cry, believe me, from pre-Vatican II perspectives that saw Judaism as moribund and obsolete after the coming of Christ in the church. In the second quote, Francis expands on the idea that the church can learn from Judaism's ongoing life with God. Quote, the best way to communicate, however, is not just talking and discussing, but making plans and realizing them together with all those who have goodwill and mutual respect in friendship. There is a rich, there's that word, complementarity that allows us to read together the texts of the Hebrew Bible, helping one another to examine the riches of God's word. Our common goal, says Pope Francis, will be to be witnesses of the Father's love in the world. For the Jew, as for the Christian, there is no doubt that love of God and neighbor summarizes all the commandments. Therefore, Jews and Christians must feel like brothers and sisters, united by the same God and by a rich common spiritual heritage, on which to build and continue to build the future. End of quote. Now, this is from the preface to that book in Italian that Professor Urbano mentioned earlier, the La Biblia della Amicizia, that consists of commentaries on important passages in the Torah and the Pentateuch by pairs of Jewish and Catholic scholars who offer commentaries. This is the quote from Pope Francis's preface, and Rabbi Skorka wrote a companion preface. Again, that's an interesting sign of the times in and of itself, I think. To me, this is yet another piece of evidence that the Jewish and Catholic relationship is becoming more and more one of mutuality. Note that shared textual study is linked here to an assertion of a sibling relationship between Jews and Christians. This idea is expressed even more strongly in the third quotation on your handout, touching on the subject of the respective identities of the two communities. Now, this is a quote from an address that Francis just gave the end of February of this year at a ceremony marking the 50th anniversary of the death of Cardinal Augustin Bea. Bea was the cardinal who was responsible for preparing Nostra Aetate. So this all sort of hangs together. Quote, says Francis, Cardinal Bea should not only be remembered for what he did, but also the way he did it. He remains a model and a source of inspiration for ecumenical and interreligious dialogue, and in an eminent way for the quote-unquote intrafamilial dialogue with Judaism, end quote. Now, the term that leaps out at me in this quotation is the phrase intrafamilial. Drawing on a 2015 statement from the Vatican's Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews, Francis here feels that the ties between Jews and Catholics are so close that conversation between them is not really interreligious, it is occurring among members of the same family, exclamation point. While this is a logical development from the Catholic Church's insistence that the books of the so-called Old Testament have canonical authority, contrary to a heresy called Marcionism way back in the 2nd century, one wonders how many Jews might fear that their distinctive ways of covenanting might be overwhelmed by the smothering embrace of their Christian siblings. I mean, how close a relationship is really desirable? Now, the 4th quotation from Francis has major Christological significance. Quote, the Christian confessions, by this he means the different Christian denominations or communities, find their unity in Christ. Judaism finds its unity in the Torah. Christians believe that Jesus Christ is the Word of God made flesh in the world. For Jews, the Word of God is present above all in the Torah. Both faith traditions find their foundation in the one God, the God of the covenant, who reveals God's self through his Word. In seeking a right attitude towards God, Christians turn to Christ as the fount of new life, and Jews to the teaching of the Torah. This pattern of theological reflection on the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, says Francis, arises precisely from Nostra Aetate. And upon this solid basis, canon must be developed yet further. Now, end of quote. Francis said this at the annual conference of the International Christians and Jews in 2015 in Rome at an audience that Rabbi Skorka helped to arrange, and we were both present to hear these words. What we see here are traces of a possibly helpful approach that has confronted to a question that has confronted Catholic theology ever since the Second Vatican Council. Here's the challenge. It is a core Christian teaching that the saving work of Christ affects all humanity. Christ is not one path to God among many others. But now that the Catholic Church has recognized and even celebrates Judaism's ongoing covenanting with God, is the saving work of Christ thereby uninvolved with his own people who do not share the Church's beliefs about him as Christ? You see the problem? Francis here expresses what could be called a logos or word Christology. Jews in their covenantal life with God encounter God's saving word, which Christians believe is entwined with the life of the first century Jew, Jesus of Nazareth. This perspective is further developed in the 5th quotation from the previously mentioned 2015 statement by the Vatican's Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews. And I want you to note in particular the words that I've put in italics in this quote. Quote, God revealed himself in his word so that it may be understood by humanity in actual historical situations. This word invites all people to respond to it. If their responses are in accord with the word of God, they stand in right relationship with God. For Jews, says this Vatican document, this word can be learned through the Torah and the traditions based upon it. Little side comment, I think the traditions based upon it is referring to the rabbinic tradition. Continuing the quote, the Torah is the instruction for a successful life in right relationship with God. Whoever observes the Torah has life in its fullness. And there's a reference here to the Pirkei Avot, which is an early rabbinic text. By observing the Torah, the Jew receives a share in communion with God. End of quote. Now, Catholics in the room, and maybe some of our Jewish friends, will recognize that the terms right relationship, life in its fullness, which, by the way, recalls Jesus' words in the Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 10, I have come that you may have life, life in its fullness, says the Johannine Jesus, and the phrase communion with God are all traditional Christian expressions about salvation. The Commission here cites a rabbinic text, the Pirkei Avot, that echoes a New Testament one as illustrating the saving value of Torah-centered Jewish covenanting. Or as Cardinal Walter Casper put it in 2001, quote, the Church believes that Judaism, in other words, the faithful response of the Jewish people to God's irrevocable covenant, is salvific for them because God is faithful to his promises, end quote. Now, I don't want to give a false impression here. It may sound paradoxical, but Catholic teaching understands both that Jews are in right relationship with God by virtue of their Torah-shaped mode of covenanting, and also that the Word of God, existentially united with Jesus of Nazareth, is also involved in that covenanting relationship. My point is that Catholic theology has taken great strides in learning how to respect and learn from and with Jews and Judaism in a process that needs continued development in conversation with Jews in the years ahead, Jews who appreciate the complex issues involved. Before saying more about next steps, I want to sort of take a little digression, if you'd permit me, and raise a related topic on the issue of identity formation, a topic that occurred to me when Rabbi Skorka mentioned Cardinal Jean-Marie Lustiger. I'm speaking about the question of the religious identity of Jews who have been baptized and entered a particular Christian tradition, most often a branch of evangelical Christianity. Lustiger, however, was baptized, as Rabbi Skorka said, baptized a Catholic as a teenager during the Second World War. His Jewish mother was killed in the Shoah. He went on to become the Cardinal Archbishop of Paris and always maintained that he still considered himself to be a Jew who had especially embraced the mission to be a light to the nations, he would say. This was, of course, a controversial claim for many folks, Jews and Catholics alike, although at his funeral, I would just note that the Kaddish was recited at the doorway of the Cathedral of Notre Dame de Paris at his funeral. So the prominent American Orthodox rabbi Michael Wishkogrod, of blessed memory, sent Lustiger an open letter in which he discussed the cardinal's claim of continued Jewishness. He wrote, quote, "You were born of a Jewish mother, therefore you are a Jew. But that doesn't mean that, from the point of view of rabbinic Judaism, you are a good Jew," end quote. Wishkogrod found particularly objectionable the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, something, quote, so bad that a Christian Jew loses all sorts of privileges in the community of Israel, such as being an acceptable witness in a rabbinic court or being counted in a prayer quorum of 10, a minyan. But Wishkogrod continues, all this in no way changes the fact that a Christian Jew remains a Jew, end quote. Wishkogrod went on from there to write that since Jews remained Torah observant in the earliest New Testament churches, that Lustiger ought to back up his claims to remaining Jewish by being Torah observant himself as a Catholic cardinal, despite the 2 millennia that had elapsed. Wishkogrod concluded his missive to Lustiger saying that, quote, "It is clear that such a decision would cause problems for both Jews and the church," end of quote, suggesting to me a somewhat tongue-in-cheek quality in Wishkogrod's letter. To my knowledge, he never received a reply from Cardinal Lustiger. I don't think he expected one. I actually knew Michael Wishkogrod at the time, a couple of years after he wrote this letter, and when we discussed this, he had a kind of twinkle in his eye as he was speaking about this. So there's no doubt there was a bit of tongue-in-cheekedness, for lack of a better phrase. Now, the reason why I bothered going into this little episode is that it's an indicator of one subject that will need continued conversation as the new Christian-Jewish relationship unfolds. As I mentioned earlier, Catholic descriptions of the Church's relationship to Jews as being intrafamilial, end quote, is hearing only one voice in the dialogue. What are Jews to think of such intimacy? In a forthcoming book chapter written with my colleague and friend, my chavrusa, Adam Gregerman, we noted that the 2015 statement by an international group of Orthodox rabbis, Rabbi Skorka mentioned it, to do the will of our Father in heaven toward a partnership between Jews and Christians, tentatively moved beyond thinking of Christians only in terms of the traditional and somewhat generic Noahide commands that apply to all Gentiles. This statement from these Orthodox rabbis, quote, affirmed the religious legitimacy of Christianity in its own terms as Christians might do for themselves, end quote. This is from Adams in my article. Most notably, the document declared, now I'm quoting the actual Orthodox document, quote, both Jews and Christians have a common covenantal mission to perfect the world under the sovereignty of the Almighty, which Rabbi Skorka also quoted, end quote. Somewhat reminiscent of that 2015 Vatican statement that we've mentioned a couple of times, these Orthodox rabbis seek to preserve continuity with past traditions while also responding to the unprecedented context of contemporary Jewish Catholic rapprochement. And the Catholic Church is trying to do something similar. To return to the Wishkograd Lustiger episode, I would insist that Jewish identity is not subject to adjudication by Catholics. Christians are not competent to judge who is Jewish and who is not. The only competent authority is the Jewish community itself, in all of its diverse movements and perspectives. So-called Messianic Jews, and I say so-called because there's lots of different names that baptized Jews would call themselves, who appeal to Christian church bodies to affirm their Jewish identities after their baptisms, are seeking something that ecclesiastical authorities are not capable of giving them. And this is an ongoing issue. I hope you see the complexities of the identity interrelationships here. My purpose in this little discussion is to observe that as Catholic and Jewish rapprochement hopefully grows and deepens in the years ahead, how each side understands its own identity in relation to the other is a major topic for future dialogue and research. Next steps. This includes the fact that major Christian doctrines developed when the Church defined itself oppositionally to Rabbinic Judaism. If they say this, we must say the different. If we say this, they have to say something else. Both sides cannot be right. It's a binary way of thinking. As my earlier brief treatment of Christological and soteriological developments in Catholic thought showed, I hope, a reassessment of classical articulations of Christian theology predicated on anti-Jewish presuppositions is going to inevitably occur as our conversations go on. Jews, too, are going to have their own reassessments to make, though naturally it'll be of a different sort. And it's not up to me to define it. Let me conclude. You'll be happy to hear, by turning from shifting identity boundaries and theological reconsiderations to say what we can learn from one another in the unprecedented climate of respect, openness, and dialogue with which we are now blessed. No previous generations have had these opportunities that we now have today. Rabbi Skorka will recall that I offered some similar ideas in response to the keynote address he gave at St. Joseph's University in 2015 when we dedicated the sculpture Synagoga and Ecclesia in our time. There's a description of it and a photograph of it on the reverse of your handout. That artwork depicts Jews and Christians as chavruta study partners, as learning from their respective sacred texts about what life with God is all about. So what are some topics we can now explore? Let me suggest 3. This is not a Trinitarian framing. It just happens I'm talking 3s. Number 1, how can God be both concerned and even involved in human history while also being beyond space and time in the created universe? This is an old problem. Both traditions have developed distinctive approaches to it. such as the mystical Kabbalistic Sephirot, or the divine emanations on the Jewish side, and Christian Trinitarian theology on the Christian side. Can we learn from each other's approaches to our shared paradoxical belief in God's immanence and transcendence? We both believe that in different ways. What can we learn from each other? 2, if God is involved in human history, and I think Rabbi Skorka says something along these lines too, it's something we both believe, both traditions believe, how are we to judge whether or which contemporary events are religiously meaningful? There are some who see the hand of God at work in everything that happens, while others dismiss the thought that God plays any role in human lives today. How do Jews and Christians go about attributing or denying theological significance to such occurrences as natural disasters, the outbreak of new and virulent diseases, the Shoah, the 1948 establishment of the State of Israel? Are there ways we can help each other to, quote, read the signs of the times, end quote, as another Vatican II document put it? Number 3, although both traditions believe that they have benefited from God's redeeming acts in history, we both know also that the world's redemption is incomplete, and we look forward to a future messianic end of days, the reign of God coming, Olam Haba, various terms that don't mean something similar. Now, Christians have tended to stress what has already happened, while Jews tend to highlight the unredeemed aspects of the human condition. What can we say to each other about our respective emphases? What can we learn from each other's hopes and experiences for our ultimate destinies? As a Catholic theologian, I have inevitably focused on theological matters. But I want to underscore the ethical point that Rabbi Skorka also made using other words. If Catholics and Jews are indeed co-covenanting companions, we are obligated by our relationship with God to collaborate in preparing the world for its inevitable destiny as the reign of God, as Olam Haba. Let our journey of friendship deepen not only Let me start that over again. Let our journey of friendship deepen not only by heartfelt dialogue and study, let it also be deepened by our working together for peace and prosperity of all the human family. Thanks.
Right, so now we have some time for questions, and myself and my colleague Rick Berry will have the microphones on either side of the room. So if anyone has any questions for one or both of our panelists? And I invite any students who might have any questions to go first. No.
Break the ice, somebody. We weren't that good that there's no question.
Any students have any questions?
Thank you both very much. My question is to Rabbi Skorka. You seem to indicate that the experience of dialogue didn't quite fit with the theory of dialogue, that the ways in which we have for the language we use for protecting our own particularity, our own identity, that the experience you had with Pope Francis didn't quite match the language that we often use, kind of protecting each other in terms of our own identity. I don't know if I'm mishearing you on that, but something happens in dialogue sometimes that the theory doesn't account for. I don't have a... Well, for example, Soloveitchik's point that people from different faith communities have something that's irreducibly different about them, and therefore it's very hard to communicate the depth of each tradition one to the other, and yet in a conversation sometimes something like that happens. So I guess what I'm trying to ask is, I guess for some comment on the surprising things that can happen in actual relationships that the theological language we have doesn't always. I'm sorry to be clumsy with it, but I'm groping a little bit here. But it was interesting to hear you say that something was happening between you and Bergoglio that, in theory, perhaps Soloveitchik couldn't account for.
Our conversation took place in the 90s, which means after many, many years of Nostra Aetate. Bergoglio is a, let us say this way, quotation signs, is a product of the Second Vatican Council, and of course, product also, it is a view towards the Jews of Nostra Aetate. This is the existential, huge difference between Soloveitchik and what we did. Between how Soloveitchik saw in its time and foresaw forever the Christian-Jewish dialogue, and how we develop this dialogue. Really, the mentor, also in quotation signs, of our dialogue is Abraham Yeshua Heschel. He foresaw in a very clear way that we must to work together in order to improve this world. What I feel, this is a commentary. Now, this was my answer. Now, a commentary in order to put a little bit more in a clearer way what I try to transmit to you. For many Jews, the sophisticated ways of theology is not our way of thinking about God. Of course, we open the book, the Siddur, the prayer book, and we speak to God, and that is it. We speak directly to God. Of course, that in Judaism, there are more sophisticated expressions, more, let's say, in quotation side, theological expressions regarding how to approach God. But when I said that Isaiah, Hosea, Amos, Micah, that from their generation onwards of prophets, I would add another book in the Jewish Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, that represents the Jewish way of thinking, or let us say my Jewish way of thinking, because there is no one way of thinking in Judaism. We have a lot of way of thinking. You know, where there are two Jews are three ideas. The other book, extraordinary book, is the book of Job, the book of Job. The great message of the book of Job, and I said that, is you cannot know about the ways of God, how God works, how the point through which I foresee we can build up our theological dialogue is to work on what God clearly demands from us to do in this world. To be humble, to work, as Micha says, with humility, to perform justice and mercy. How to do this and how to develop it, this must be the first theological language between us. And so it was when we wrote together the book. This is the point. This is the answer. Now, regarding what can I learn from the other, of course that I can learn about the spirituality of the other. I saw my good friend Karen Pope served with ecstasies in certain moments. I remember sometime I was in the Vatican very close to him when he went out to give a mass, to celebrate the mass for thousands of people, and his concentration, spirituality. I learned from that. It's very interesting, all the theology, but the points of the theology, or answers, is 1948, the creation of the State of Israel. Was God in the middle? I suppose that yes. I had a feeling that in some way he was. What occurred in the Shoah? I had the feeling that I had to maintain silence. But I cannot say something theologically about it. There's no theology after Auschwitz for us. For us, I mean, for me.
I'd like to make a couple of comments, if I might, to give a slightly different tack that's complementary. Number one, you asked about Soloveitchik's argument that it's impossible to speak, even within one's own religious community, to deep-seated experiences. I want to say that in the last 50 years, we have empirical evidence that that isn't true. And I think what Rabbi Skorka was just speaking to is many of us that have been involved in dialogue for any period of time have had experiences of perceiving holiness in the other. And, you know, holiness is one of those things that you know it when you experience it, but don't try and define it. You know, it's very difficult. And I have had experiences of holiness. I used the word chavrusa earlier, chavruta study. And in case people are not familiar with that term, Christians in particular, it's the traditional rabbinic mode of studying Talmud in pairs. And the purpose of that paired study is that there are different interpretations that are read out of the text, and the partners learn from one another's different ways of disassembling and reassembling the text. Sometimes you switch roles or switch opinions in order to sort of explore the further dimensions of the text. I am really blessed, I mentioned this in passing, but I'm really blessed at St. Joseph's University in having a Jewish colleague, Adam Gregerman, where we set aside, at least we tried to, regular study time to do this with not just biblical texts that we share, but also texts we don't share. And there is nothing more powerful, to me, in my life experience, you know, theologically. And sort of there's a new layer to add to this, I think, for all of us. I want to point to the publication a few years ago now in a second edition of something called the Jewish Annotated New Testament, right? Which is a commentary on all the New Testament books by Jewish exegetes, about 65 who comment on the books of the New Testament, and there's thematic essays at the end. That would have been impossible 25 years ago. but the level of sophistication of Jewish scholars of New Testament texts and Christian studies of rabbinic texts permits a depth of interaction that has never, ever happened in history. And I mean that quite literally, even though it sounds hyperbolic, but that's the way it is. So I think all that is wrapped up in your question, too.
I would like just to put two phrases more, complementary phrases. The word havruta, the form of the word havruta is Aramaic, and the root of the word is haver. Haver means a friend. Lechaber in Hebrew is to compound. Now, there is a saying in the Talmud, o havruta, o mituta. O we are in havruta, or we are in death.
Or as somebody has translated it, give me my study partner or give me death.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's true.
If Adam watches this video, don't take that literally.
Thank you. Thank you both very much for your talk and for all the important work that you do. The impression I get from what you're saying is that it's important to have sort of academic dialogue and to broaden that at the higher levels, but I'm interested in your thoughts about more of a bottom-up type of approach. At my synagogue, Temple Emmanuel, we've had some classes where Arthur Urbano and Rabbi Franklin have co-taught, and I think that's very powerful. It's sort of small scale, but expanding that, groups of people from different faiths studying or just talking with each other, I think is very powerful and important. And perhaps you're both already doing this, to a large degree, but I'm curious as to your thoughts about that.
What you are doing, as many other synagogues and parishes throughout the world, is very, very important. To present, to put together. There are in other languages there are better words. I don't know exactly in English. In Hebrew is lehafgish, to present one to the other it's extraordinarily important that Christians, after so bitter history in the relationships in the Middle Ages, especially in Europe, between Jews and Christians, that they can come together and to share things. For instance, when I began serving as a rabbi in a synagogue in the suburbs of the city of Buenos Aires, is since before Nuestra Etate, the rabbi of this congregation was very befriended with a priest, and they organized interfaith activities. I remember when I began working in this congregation, the rabbi was sick, so I took the rabbinical position, and it was organized before my coming to the congregation that for a Kabbalat Shabbat, for a service, a religious service of Kabbalat Shabbat, to have the great part of the members of the parish present, seeing what the Kabbalat Shabbat means, and the priest spoke about the importance of the dialogue. And he said a very known phrase, but a very, very important phrase. The only way to build up bigotry, to build up fanaticism, to build up hate against the other, to satanize the other, is on the base of ignorance. When you speak about that the Jew is a Satan, and is this and it is that, and you cannot speak, you have not a human relationship of friendship with a Jew, you can transform easily, you can transform the Jew in some kind of Satan that you must kill. And this is the importance of what you do in your synagogue and parish, or with these institutions. This is let me tell you an anecdote that I very frequent tell. Francis, in a phone conversation, Pope Francis told me, "I wish you in Auschwitz when I am going to be there." When I left Auschwitz, is Birkenau to be exact, is the Polish a Polish team of journalists recorded me and asked me interviewed me. At certain moment one asked me, "Tell me, what is the importance of the dialogue? What is the importance of the interfaith dialogue?" Really, it was a shocked question. How to define in 2 minutes the importance after what we talked to hours, and we can continue talking more and more and more. But God illuminated me, and I indicated on the barracks on Birkenau, and I told them, "You see this barracks, you know what occurred in this barracks in Birkenau, how people were denigrated and assassinated, and what occurred there. This occurred because a real dialogue didn't exist between Jews and Christians in a great dimension." I'm not saying that Nazism is a consequence of Christianity. No way. But as Cardinal Casper says, the lack of a great attitude of Christians in order to be more involved in the fate of the Jews during the Shoah would be absolutely different. What we different.
And if I would just say, I think I want to endorse what you said, or I think you said about a theology from below. This relationship is new for all of us. And there's a lot to be learned in living room dialogues of people, of Jews and Christians together. There are books that exist and little essays to be read, structured curricula for such things. I spoke last week at the final meeting of a dialogue group that met in somebody's home. They started and they went on for 20 years. And this is not unique. It's not it happens. And it was just ordinary Jews and ordinary Catholics getting together. They'd read a book together. Sometimes they ask for advice on what to turn to next. But I think leaders in churches and synagogues, or theological religious scholars, we learn from the experiences of people in their living rooms. That's the novelty of the experience. So I just want to affirm the general thrust of your question. And there are more and more resources that are being produced to help organize such efforts.
Hi, my name is Holly Taylor Kuhlman, and I teach theology here at PC.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah, hi.
Just hearing
Sorry.
your voice.
So I want to say thank you so much to Phil, whom I know, and thank you so much to Rabbi Skorka for coming. Thank you all especially for the way that both of you mentioned the Cardinal Lustiger and the letter from Wyshegrad. I myself read that letter not too long after it became public, semi-public.
Yeah.
The recipient of the letter was not named.
Oh, yeah.
But the letter was published, and it absolutely shaped my own academic work in a very significant way. I just read it, and I thought, this is a theological question. This is a real question to be asked here. And I'll just say for the room also that you can find that letter and then a number of responses again, the recipient of the letter was not named, but in 1995, that letter was published in Modern Theology, in the journal Modern Theology, with a number of Christian respondents, and maybe Wishergod himself offered one of the reflections. Here's the quick question that I would like to ask. As you look at next steps, does it seem to you that the challenges of secularization, certainly as it's happening in the US, and to some extent in Europe and other places, does it give more challenges or more opportunities in this dialogue?
For me, Heschel's article, "No Religion is an Island," continues being actual, relevant. He speaks about nihilism, that the world, that the great part of humankind is going to nihilism. Okay, you used another secularization. When we speak about the dialogue and about the common denominators that we have, yeah, the great base in common that we have, it's what is separating us is theological things. It's about God, perceptions about God. But what is unifying us is a culture in which we have the same idea about family, the same idea about, okay, with some variants, but the core idea that sex must be related to affection, to a deep sentiment. This is what we are sharing. And so I could give more and more and more examples about the great things in a culture, understanding the word culture of in a wide sense, how we live, what are our really value, our really values, our truly values, and what we believe. It's not only to believe in God, to have spirituality. These are, of course, very, very important values that we share. But we are sharing, for instance, the values of the family institutions that here in America you know very well. The institution of family here in the United States, as well as a great part of the world, is disappearing or is losing its consistency. This is regarding family. And so we can find a lot of other examples that we are sharing, and of course that the quinta essence of the article of Heschel is to this point. Let us, you believe in the Bible, the whole Bible, we believe in the Bible. Okay, we have differences, different points of view in theological things. But in human things, we are sharing so many important points that modernity are destroying. And we, in accordance to Heschel, we have to be as a barrier against, to save, against the destruction, in order to save all those values.
I have a bit of a different take on your question. Your question, of course, could be the subject of a semester-long course. You know, is secularity a threat or an opportunity? I forgot how exactly you put it. I think I would lean toward more of the opportunity side, although not dispensing with the problems and dangers. But let's it seems to me that a look back at history will reveal that secularity arose in the Enlightenment, and that it was the Enlightenment that gave rise to the thought of basic human rights, and the Catholic tradition opposed that notion of intrinsic rights for quite a while, and now it's ordinary Catholic teaching. I was just teaching it earlier today, the Catholic social teaching, and the rights that people have for freedom of religion and freedom of speech and da-da-da-da-da. And so there's a way in which the dialogue that exists now between Jews and Christians, Jews and Catholics in particular, was partially enabled by the Enlightenment. And so I don't want to lose that. There's an element of opportunity that this presents when we, in other words, I think to riff on what Rabbi Skorka said, I think what we share as well in the United States between Jews and Christians is a common affirmation of certain basic human rights. And those human rights can serve as the basis for our interaction. If we didn't share that in common, I don't know, it would be a different Star Trek alternate timeline, and I don't know what it would actually look like. But the fact that we live in a society that says the state is not going to give preferential treatment to one religion over another sets up a kind of level playing field that doesn't exist in other countries, and enables us to disagree about stuff, but I have to acknowledge my other religious interlocutor's right to believe differently. And so I think that's a positive outcome of secularity in a broad sense.
The great question that we must ask is if the Enlightenment, the idea of democracy and so on, there's a question, I put that as a question, is not also an element that we can find in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible. This is the point.
This is an ongoing conversation, so there was I think, yeah.
Professor Cunningham, you alluded in your looking forward to future issues to talk about to something that I have often spoken about in teaching. Jews often denigrate Christianity because they see the triune God as something they don't understand at all, and try to dismiss it. And what I have often said is that Christianity, as I see it, is dealing with the same things that Judaism is dealing with, namely God as being transcendent and immanent, God of creation, God of history, God of personal concern, and so forth. We, of course, don't have the third component, Holy Spirit, which I still, after many Catholics have tried to explain to me, I don't understand. But I see this as metaphor, and I'm wondering how Catholics deal with metaphor. Can Catholics deal with this as metaphor, or is this something concrete in terms of how you conceptualize God?
The it is the Trinity?
Yes, the it, yes, I'm sorry.
So, boy, this would take...
That's another course.
Okay. So, standing on one foot, or sitting on... Well, anyway, here's how I would approach an answer, but realize what I'm about to say is so brief that it's going to be inadequate. So, I think I would want to start off by saying that language is metaphoric, right? Our very ability to communicate with words via language is constantly metaphoric. And unless our words have a common metaphoric understanding in both parties, they're meaningless. If someone started to speak in a language that I don't Basque, there's nothing going on there because we don't share the metaphor, we don't share the grammar, and I mean that in a sort of expansive philosophical sense, to be able to communicate. So when we're talking about the involvement of God, the transcendent one beyond all, beyond space-time and everything else, who is involved in our lives, of course it's going to be metaphoric. And of course, because that's all we can communicate in. Even if we were talking about the measurements of that chair, it's metaphoric in a very deep sense. So speaking about about something as beyond human ken as God, yes, of course, it's metaphoric. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't conform to some reality of some sort, but the reality is going to be, in this particular case, the understanding of God as triune is reflecting in metaphoric speech the church's experience of encountering God in this way. And this is not shared in the Jewish tradition, right? The Jewish tradition has its own experiences of encountering God that it will articulate in metaphoric speech, because all speech is metaphoric, but will also do it in the contours of a tradition that has developed over centuries, just as Christians do. The problem that I think creeps in here for both of us, or anybody doing, work of articulating very abstract trans-historical things, is that as centuries go by, the philosophical orientation of the cultures change with time. And so earlier ways of trying to articulate, in the Catholic world, we'll say a doctrine, we'll have a certain formula for articulating a doctrine. There are three persons in one God. Well, that formula is based on a Neoplatonic philosophy that nobody thinks in contemporary Catholicism unless you're a scholar of Neoplatonism, right? So the word person in that ancient formula actually means the exact opposite of what we mean by person today, which is an individual, self-conscious, individuated consciousness. I'm not saying that very well. But that's not what the folks that came out with that formula meant. And so there's a whole translation process that has to be undertaken in order to articulate doctrines formulated in one philosophical system to have it make sense in a current philosophical system. And the same thing is going to be true in the Jewish tradition, but Jewish tradition is not based so much on Hellenistic philosophies the way that Christianity developed, and so it's a different kind of enterprise. But I'll just tell you, you told an anecdote, so now I get to tell an anecdote, and say that the church that I grew up in, my home parish in Queens, New York, then, it's been covered over now, but it was built in 1950, around the time that the doctrine of the Assumption of Mary was defined. And so there's this large, the apse, or I think it's called, it must be like 60, 100 feet tall, right? And there's this picture of Mary ascending to heaven, or being assumed into heaven. And at the top, I don't know the proper architectural terms, but at the top where the kind of pointed of this curved space comes together, God is waiting. And God is depicted as a white-haired, bearded gentleman sitting on a throne. Standing next to him is a middle-aged, brown-haired gentleman with his hands like this. And flying over the two of them is a bird with beams of light emanating from it. Now, third grade, that was my introduction to the Trinity. Now, I'm not belittling the artist, because how do you put in, and I'm getting away from Avodah Zarah, right? Let's not go down that road right now. But how does one graphically express the Trinity if you're going to undertake that challenge? I don't know what my classmates think now, right? Because what we were taught the formula in our catechism, three persons in one God, and we go into church and we see two guys and a bird. Right? Now, and I'm not saying this to belittle the tradition. I'm saying that the fundamental undergirding of your question is pointing to a deep truth, namely, and you were emphasizing this repeatedly, that humility, when we're speaking about the Godhead, is a sine qua non, right? It has to be there. And there's certain things that it's going to be beyond our limits of human language to not only express, but even to conceptualize in our heads, because we think linguistically in our heads, right? So I hope that made some sort of sense.
We have a question from a student here.
All right, so I apologize for this being a little lengthy, but
Well, it's your answers. You ought to
I
worry about it.
kind of wrote it up after you guys both gave your guys' speeches. So During Jesus' time, Christ's walk of life, were his core teachings and walk of life to bring together the Gentiles and the Jewish community for the significance and purpose of a calling that we are all one people of the one God? And if Jesus was a Jewish man, and by the Christian perspective, God came to the world to be God and man to unite the human people as a whole, so how did Jesus' actions and teachings become separate from the Jewish people who had the first covenant with the one God?
Okay.
I understand Jesus' critique. What? It goes on, yeah.
Go ahead.
I understand Jesus critiques the Jewish law and in doing so preaches and expresses the true word of the one God. However, his critiques and word were for the sake of bringing humanity together as one people in the one God. So are we all one people under one God? When are we going to realize that we all are and share the existence of this life under the one God for the sake of each other in union with God? Not for the sake of whose community is holier or more righteous than the other, but rather because we are all created just as important as the other under God. So you guys stated that Christians and Jews are like brothers, so do you think that the Jews and Christians will ever come together as one religion under God?
Okay, so these are excellent questions. I want to praise you for your questions, but sit down because the answer is going to take a little while. Here's how. First of all, there's any number of different ways that one could begin to answer. I think maybe a dozen different questions that were embedded in what you read. So this is not going to get to all of them. Your questions about Jesus can be approached on a historical level. What did Jesus, a first century Galilean Jew, do and say and think? We have to acknowledge that there is limited historical evidence upon which to try and answer those kinds of questions. But having said that, I'll give a quick answer. From what we can tell, and this is summing up like all kinds of stuff in a few sentences, Jesus was convinced that God was about to intervene in human history and bring about the reign of God, the age to come, Olam Haba. His parables, if you think about the parables that you're acquainted with, the kingdom of God is like a man that had two sons. The kingdom of God is like a guy that gave a wedding feast. The kingdom of God is like a guy that had 100 sheep and one gets lost. Right? Think of how many parables begin with the phrase, the kingdom or the reign of God is like something. Metaphor. Right? And so Jesus has to be understood in the context of late Second Temple Jewish expectations about where history was leading, what the destiny of everything was. And again, there's a variety of opinions, as Rabbi Skorka mentioned earlier, but the root basis, common denominator is a phrase that Rabbi Skorka has used, is that God's will one day prevail over everything that exists. Everything will function the way God intends for it to function. That's the reign of God. That's the age to come. Jesus felt that that was going to happen really soon. And that maybe his own death would be a part of the process of God's intervention. So you asked, the way you framed your question, if I recall it right, was something on the order of, is the vision that all human beings are somehow brought together? And the answer to the question is more or less yes, that God wills in the Jewish tradition as well as in the Christian tradition for all human beings to be living in peace and in solidarity with one another. Jesus felt that that was imminent. That was soon going to happen. There was a lot packed into your question, so I'm sort of hesitating as to where to go with some of them. Let me just jump to the end, if I could, with a capital E, and say that for Jews and Christians today, I would not answer your last question affirmatively. Your last question was something like, do I ever foresee that there will be a sort of common religion of Jews and Christians? I'm trying to think of a clever name for it, but I'm not coming up with it. I think the answer to that is no in historic time. We are on a journey as Jews and Christians toward the establishment of the reign of God. We Christians have certain expectations as to how that's going to happen and what it's going to look like, and Jews have expectations about how that's going to happen and how it's going to look like. There's some similarities and there's some differences between the multiple Jewish and Christian points of view. But what we both believe is that at the end of days, God's will is going to prevail over creation and all of humanity will be united in peace. That's the best I can do very quickly with your questions. And I know it leads to others, but that's, I'll just interject that what the Christian tradition did after the time of Jesus was to understand that the coming of God's kingdom was going to take longer than originally anticipated and adjusted accordingly. But that's covering, that's covering 2 millennia of development when I put it in those words. So I hope that answers partially at least your. Okay. Is this on tape? There's a historic moment here.
I'd like to thank you both, and would you join me in thanking both Rabbi Skorka and Professor Cunningham for thank you for a stimulating dialogue and some ideas of where we can go next in our dialogue in our local communities and here in our series. So for any of you who are participating and registered for the colloquium tomorrow morning, we'll be in this room and we'll get started at 9:30. So we'll see you here in the morning. And to the rest of you, have a good night and safe travels. Hopefully it stopped raining.